Greetings to everyone. I hope that you're having a very warm and cozy Christmas. A very warm and cozy Christmas season. At least for those of you that are living in the northern hemisphere of the globe. You know, the globe Earth. Woo! The globe Earth! Yeah. I hope you're all having a good, nice, warm season. And you have a happy Yuletide and a wonderful Christmas. A very jolly Christmas at that. Very wonderful, very cozy Christmas. This is the season to give. No, not to receive, but to give. 'Tis the season to be not self-centered or selfish or greedy. It is the season to forgive. To give freely of your own heart. To share with other people something good. Now, Forge! Gang! I am still a hard man! Let's go! And so we begin. Who was Cornelius Jansen? I should have probably started off with talking about St. Augustine of Hippo, or St. Augustine. St. Augustine would have been a very good background biography to go through. Would have, who's the British, Pelagius, that's it, Pelagius. Pelagius and St. Augustine would have been very good background biographies to cover. But Cornelius Jansen is a good one to start with. You know, but it is Christmas time, and this is the season to give. Not to be self-centered, not to be hateful, but it is the season to give. Interdimensional Lizard says the Christmas tree. Very nice, wonderful holiday spirits. Interdimensional Lizard says, best Christmas wishes to you too, Warhammer. Thank you. Thank you so much, Lizard. I hope you have a wonderful Christmas. Chauncey, Ghost of Niccolo, dedicated an entire game stream to you last night. Defeating the vile, disgusting Soberman. Ghost of Niccolo dedicated an entire stream just for you, buddy. What's up, Chauncey Fat Sack? Merry Christmas. This is the season where, according to tradition, our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ died on the cross for the sins of all the world. You know, and it's also the Yuletide, Christmas carol, and chestnuts, and roasted chestnuts, and, you know, dilapidated, strangulated Mormonites. Oh, I wasn't supposed to say that last one. Corny Jansen. Sebastian Moran says, Forge Christmas! Let's go! Little Stimmy on the high end, always just be right on the high end, just be dotting on the high end. Let's go. Chauncey Fatsack says, White Boy Christmas. White Boy Christmas. Only a hard man would understand. Let's see here. Dreaming of only a white Christmas. Chauncey says, Happy Christmas, Forge. Thank you. Ghost of Niccolo is such a hard man. Yes, indeed he is. Cornelius Jansen was usually known by the Latin name of Jansenius, was born on October 28th, 1585. He died May the 6th, 1638. He was a Catholic bishop of Ape, a Spanish, Netherlands-based Dutch Roman Catholic theologian and the father of the religious movement known as Jansenism. Jansen studied at the University of Leuven, and became imbued with the purpose of reviving Christian theology according to the teachings of Augustine. He established a close friendship with Duvergier de Harane, Duverger de Harine, a fellow student, with whom he shared and developed many of his theological ideas. In 1630, Jansen became professor at Leuven, and in 1636 he became the bishop of Ypres. Out of his life work, Augustinus, published posthumously in 1642 in Latin. And this is so unfortunate because this work was never translated into English. This work is still in Latin, and I don't know enough Latin to read it. And I would absolutely enjoy reading the Augustinus. Perhaps it could be AI translated or something, but it's very long. But if possible, and if maybe given the time, it could be AI translated. I'm not going to go to a woke publisher or to a woke translator. Arose the movement called Jansenism. Duvergier de Harine, who became the Abbé of Saint Cyran, won over Marie Angelique Arnauld, Abbess of Port Royal, and through her the nuns of the convent of Port Royal, which became a focus of resistance against the Jesuits. Jansenism held that it is impossible for a person to overcome the corruption of original sin without God's grace, and that this grace, when given, is irresistible. It is an irresistible grace. Jansenists also believed that only an elect number would ultimately be saved by the grace of God. This is related to the Calvinist doctrine of predestination. Jansenists criticized the Jesuits for moral laxity. They also accused them of semi-Pelagianism. In 1642, Pope Urban VIII forbid the reading of the Augustinus in his bull In Immanenti. This was in 1653. Pope Innocent X condemned Jansenism as heretical. In 1709, Louis XIV, who saw the conflict between the Jansenists and the Jesuits as a threat to the unity of France, ordered the dispersal of the nuns of Port Royal to other convents. And in 1710, he had the abbey completely destroyed. Cornelius Jansen was born on October 28, 1585, to a Catholic family in the village of Acquie, or Acquie, in the province of Utrecht near Leerdam, Netherlands. His parents, although in moderate circumstances, secured for him an excellent education and sent him first to Utrecht. According to the custom adopted by the humanists of the Renaissance, Jansen Latinized his name to Cornelius Jansenius. In 1602, he entered the Collège du Faucon at the University of Leuven, to take up the study of philosophy. After 2 years at the solemn promotion of 1604, he was proclaimed first of 118 competitors. He began his theological studies at the Collège du Pape. Adrian VI, whose president, Jacques Jansen, taught the doctrine of the theological Michael de Bay, who died in 1589 in Louvain. Bayes, inspired by Augustine, taught humanity is affected from its birth by the sin of Adam, his ancestor, and that his instincts lead him necessarily to evil. Humans can be saved only by the grace of Christ, accorded to a small number of the elect who have been chosen in advance and destined to enter the kingdom of heaven. This doctrine attracted Jansen and another student, a Frenchman named Jean du Vaurier de Hourenay, afterwards abbot of Saint Chiron and a leader of the Jansenist movement. Jansen and Duvergier became friends in Paris, where Jansen went in 1604 and determined to revive theology, which they believed had been reduced to subtle and vain discussions among scholastics by the theologians of the Sorbonne. Jansen and Duvergier believed that men should render homage to God, and that the pride of Renaissance intellectualism had alienated Christians from the Jesus who loved the simple and the humble. In 1611, Jansen followed Duvergier to his parents' home, located in the outskirts of Bouin, and was entrusted by the bishop of the city with the direction of the Episcopal College there from 1612 to 1614. Afterwards, Jansen, with Duvergier, dedicated himself to the study of the writings of the early church fathers. In 1616, Jansen returned to Louvain to take charge of the College of St. Pulcheria, a hostel for Dutch students of theology. Among his students, he had the reputation of being somewhat choleric and an exacting master, as well as a recluse from academic society. However, he took an active part in the university's resistance to the Jesuits, who had established a theological school of their own in Louvain for the sake of the Counter-Reformation, which was proving to be a formidable rival to the official university faculty of divinity. A violent dispute had arisen at Louvain between the Jesuits and the disciples of Baius, whose theology had been condemned by Pope Pius V in 1567. Jansen began a thorough study of the works of Augustine, which had inspired Baius, paying special attention to the texts written against the doctrine of Pelagius, who denied original sin and held that humanity is entirely free to do good works and to obtain salvation by means of its own merit. In the hope of suppressing the Jesuit encroachments, Jansen was sent twice to Madrid, Spain, in 1624 and 1626. The second time, he narrowly escaped the Inquisition. He warmly supported the Catholic missionary Archbishop, Apostolic Vicar of the Northern Netherlands, Ravinius, in his contests with the Jesuits, who were trying to evangelize that country without regard to the archbishop's wishes. He also crossed more than once the Dutch Calvinist Presbyterian Gisbertus Voetius, still remembered for his attacks on René Descartes. Chauncey, Ghost of Niccolo did an entire wrestling match just for you, good sir. Let's see here. What else was I going to... Jansen yearned to show that Roman Catholics could interpret the Bible in just as mystical and pietistic a manner as the Protestants, and made this the object of his lectures when he was appointed Regius Professor of Scriptural Interpretation at Leuven in 1630. To this end, he devoted himself to Augustinus, a bulky treatise on the theology of Augustine, barely finished at the time of his death. Jansen supported the idea of Belgium achieving its independence from Spain and becoming a Catholic republic, possibly even Flemish ruled, similar to the Protestant United Provinces. These ideas became known to the Spanish rulers, and to assuage them he wrote the Mars Gallicus, 1635, a violent attack on French ambitions generally, and on Cardinal Richelieu's indifference to international Catholic interest. The Mars Gallicus had the desired effect. After acquiring the degree of doctor in theology at Leuven, Jansen was made the rector there in 1635. In 1636, he was appointed Bishop of Leper in West Flanders by the Pope and the Spanish court. In 1638, 2 years after his elevation to the episcopate, Jansen died of the plague. So this is about the Augustinius. In 1640, despite the efforts of the internuncio Richard Aravius to thwart them, Jansen's friends in Leuven published the work he had dedicated to Augustine, Saint Augustine of Hippo, under the title Augustinius Cornelii Jansene Episcopi Seu Doctorani Sancti Augustani di Humane Naturae Santo Naturae Sanatate Igredudeni Medicina adversus Pelagianos et Mausolinensis. In English, the Augustine of Cornelius Jansen, Bishop, or on the doctrines of St. Augustine concerning human nature, health, grief, and cure against the Pelagians and Massilians. Jansen had spent 22 years writing the book. In the epilogue, Jansen declared, "I leave my work to the judgment of the Roman Church. I retract all that she will decide that I must retract." These theses were condemned by the Holy Office in 1643 and 1653, respectively. The work was divided into 3 volumes. The first, chiefly historical, was an exposition on the 8 books of Pelagianism. The second, after an introductory study on the limitations of human reason, was devoted to the states of innocence, fallen nature, and pure nature. The third volume comprised 10 books on the grace of Christ the Savior, and concluded with a parallel between the errors of the semi-Pelagians and that of certain moderns. Jansen claimed that in order to write the book, he had to read the entire works of Augustine 10 times, and the treatise against the Pelagians 30 times. Jansen based his doctrine on two Augustinian concepts. One was the distinction between the grace originally endowed by God on humanity at the creation, so that it could dwell in oneness with God, and the grace which seeks to elevate fallen humanity from its sinful state. The other concept was the theory of the victorious delectation of grace, in which a man willingly and voluntarily acts in a way that overcomes sinfulness and evil, because he profoundly believes acting in that way will bring him the greatest pleasure. Jansen and Bias believed that God endowed people at the creation with a human nature which necessarily sought the vision of God. Beatitude has its ultimate purpose. As a result of Adam's sin, human nature became deprived, and was stripped of elements necessary for its integrity. The human will became unable to resist the corruption of original sin, unless it is aided by a movement of grace superior to and triumphant over evil. The human soul, motivated only by the desire to seek the greatest pleasure, is impulsively and irresistibly drawn to the force which attracts it the most. If this force comes from heaven and grace, the soul is drawn to virtue. If it comes from original sin and fallen nature, the soul is determined to sin. A man or woman irresistibly but voluntarily does good or evil, depending on whether he is dominated by grace or by original sin. Jansen compared the attractions of grace and evil to the arms of a scale, where one side goes down when the other rises. Condemnation of Jansen's teachings. The Augustinius was widely read throughout Belgium, Holland, and France, and a new edition bearing the approbation of 10 doctors of the Sorbonne soon appeared in Paris. On August 1st, 1641, by a decree of the Holy Office, condemned the work and prohibited its reading. The following year, Urban VIII forbid the reading of Augustinius in his bull In Immanenti, on the grounds that Catholics were forbidden to publish anything on the subject of grace without the authorization of the Holy See, and that it reproduced several of the errors of Baius. Though the Pope also forbade several other works directed against the Augustinius, the bull was not easily accepted by all Roman Catholics. Some pretended that the bull had been forged or interpolated, and in Belgium, where the Archbishop of Mechlin and the university were favorable to Jansen's ideas, the controversy lasted for 10 years. And this brings us to the result of his works and lifelong endeavors. The movement known as Jansenism, which lasted from about 1646 to 1801. It ended with the rise of Napoleon. Duvergier de Hirune, who had become the Abbé of Saint Cyran, won over the family of Arnwald of Andely, particularly Marie Angelique Arnwald, Abbess of Port Royal, and through her the nuns of the convent of Port Royal, which became the focus of resistance against the Jesuits. The Jansenists adopted a rigoristic position in Christian ethics and criticized their Jesuit opponents for moral laxity. When Duvergier de Hérunet died in 1643, Dr. Antoine Arnould succeeded him as head of the movement which he had created, and soon published on frequent communion. A conflict arose between the Jesuits and Antoine Arnould, who called himself an Augustinian. The Jesuits called him a Jansenist, claiming that his doctrines originated with Jansen and not with St. Augustine. In 1649, Carnet, syndic of the Sorbonne, extracted 5 propositions from the Augustinius and on frequent communion and submitted them to the judgment of the faculty. When the French Parliament prevented the faculty from pursuing the examination they had begun, it was referred to the General Assembly of the Clergy in 1650. 85 bishops considered it more fitting that Rome should pronounce judgment, and submitted the 5 propositions to Innocent X. 11 other bishops protested to the Pope against the idea of bringing the matter of trial outside of France, demanding a special tribunal and the opening of a debate in which the theologians of both sides should be allowed to submit their arguments. Innocent X appointed a commission consisting of 5 cardinals and 13 consultors, some of whom were known to favor the Jansenist. The commission met for 36 long sessions, with the Pope presiding in person over the last 10. Advocates of the Augustinius finally presented a table with 3 columns, in which they distinguished 3 interpretations of the 5 propositions: a Calvinistic interpretation, rejected theretofore as heretical; a Pelagian or semi-Pelagian interpretation, identified as the more traditional doctrine, which was in need of modification; and lastly, their interpretation has the idea of St. Augustine himself. This presentation did not avert condemnation of the 5 propositions as heresy by the papal bull Cum Occasiani, May 31st, 1653. The 5 propositions. Some of God's commandments are impossible to just men who wish and strive to keep them, considering the powers these just individuals actively have. The grace by which these precepts may become possible for them is lacking. In the fallen state, it is the nature of man never to resist interior grace. To merit or demerit in the fallen state, man must be free from all external constraint, but not from interior necessity. The semi-Pelagians admitted the necessity of interior grace for all acts, even for the beginning of faith, but they fell into heresy in pretending that this grace is such that man may either follow or resist it. To say that Christ died or shed his blood for all men is semi-Pelagianism. The condemnation was reiterated by Innocent's successor, Alexander XII. The French bishops were required to make all of the priests, monks, and nuns sign a formulary accepting the Pope's declaration. In 1656 and 1657, Blaise Pascal wrote Les Provinciales, the provincial letters, satirizing the moral reasoning of the Jesuits in defense of Antoine Arnauld, who was condemned by the faculty of theology at the Sorbonne. Louis XIV of France was determined to eliminate the Jansenists as a threat to the unity of his kingdom. There was a temporary respite when Clement IX became Pope in 1667, and the papacy and the French Roman Catholic Church clashed over Gallicanism. After this controversy was settled in 1705, Louis XIV obtained from Clement XI the bull Veneam Domine, renewing the earlier condemnations. In 1709, Louis XIV ordered the dispersal of the nuns of Port Royal to other convents, and in 1710, he had the abbey completely destroyed. In 1713, the bull Unigenitus de Filius condemned 101 propositions of Pasquer Quesnel, who had succeeded Arnwald, his head of the Jansenist, in 1694. The promulgation of Unigenitus as French law in 1730 finally caused the strength of the Jansenist party to decline. In 1723, followers of Jansen's views established an autonomous Jansenist church in Utrecht, Holland, which still existed in the late 20th century. Jansenism also spread to Italy in 1786. The Synod of Pistoia, which was later condemned, propounded extreme Jansenist doctrines. Jansenism is important in the history of philosophy because of the development of Port Royal logic and the influence of Jansenist leader Arnwald on French philosophy and politics. More importantly, as a result of the First Vatican Council in 1871, the Pope acclaimed has complete doctrinal matter papal infallibility. And the Jansenists at Utrecht in Holland, as well as Old Catholics in Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and the Netherlands and Belgium, succeeded and broke away from the Roman Catholic Church and formed the Old Catholics, or the Old Catholics, who rejected the Immaculate Conception and the Marian doctrines, including the devotion to the Sacred Heart, as well as papal infallibility. They also rejected the notions of what Pius XII proclaimed in about 1950 regarding the Virgin Mary. And so that is some of the lessons about the Jansenists. I wanted to do this first before I got into St. Augustine, because St. Augustine is going to be much more longer and there's a lot more details to cover, even though his was much earlier than actually Jansenism. But I find Jansenism to be a very particularly interesting and very fascinating philosophy. They did not try to break away from the Catholic Church, at least not until 1871 or 1962. And in many ways, you could say that Vatican II was actually an adoption of some of the Jansenist propositions into the pontificate. Vatican I was a complete rejection and affirmation of ultramontane doctrines, and Vatican II was a bit of an accepting of some semi-Jansenist and Augustinian principles and precepts, such as the use of the vernacular in the Mass, or the vernacular in the use of the liturgy. So, overall, it's very interesting. I don't really believe in free will. I do believe in free agency, but I don't think that men have the free will to do just whatever they want. I think it's fallaciously, horrendously atrocious to think that a serial killer can obtain God's saving grace by simply going and attending Mass and taking the sacrament, even though he is a serial killer and he just massacred several people in Minecraft the day before. I don't consider that to be salvific. I do not believe in I do believe in original sin, and I do believe in some forms of predestination, though not complete predestination. And I don't consider and I do not believe that everyone is going to go to heaven any more than I think everyone's going to go to hell. I think that God pre-selects people, and I do not believe in absolute free will. And so on that note, was there any questions in regards to Jansenism? Any regards to the Augustinius and to Cornelius Jansen, 1585 to 1640 or to 1638 is when he lived? Chauncey Fatsack says that Ghost of Niccolo is such a hard man. Sebastian Morin, just like the ones used to know. Just like the ones I used to know. Chauncey Fatsack says Jennyism. Chauncey Fatsack says, oy vey, Jensen the Janny. He swept it for the Catholic Church. He did. Or at least he tried to, but they rejected his ideas. Use Rosetta Stone on Strayman to read it. On stream to read it. Based Latin Warhammer. O magardi eugenitus sancti Maria, gimotare boluraci la preta, repirati arrivedercia. Momento more. Corp diem. Tempest fugit. Carpe diem. Forget about it. Forget about it. That sounds a bit more like Braveheart. All right. Code of Truth says, Forge! Chauncey Fatsack says, gang! Ghost of Niccolo says, hello, good sirs. Ghost of Niccolo says, Chauncey, what was the name of that old detective that called the reporter a crumb lush? Chauncey says it's Frank Rizzo, the original crumb bum wise guy, LOL. Ghost of Niccolo says Frank Rizzo was a hard man. Chauncey says I am FAO. Rick Perry, I don't think you're a hard man. I think you're a soft man. Augustinian nuns are hard women. Chauncey Fatsack says, nope. Thanks for the lesson. Ghost of Niccolo says, could you do some streams over the saints you think are the most interesting? I certainly could. Sebastian Moran wanted me to do a stream about Roswell. I'll have to do some research into it. But anyways, yeah. One of the things about Jansenism that I like in particular is on the primitivistic, patristic, and biblical primitivism. So in a way, the Jansenists were actually sort of a Catholic restorationist sect in all but name. They wanted to go back to the purity of the early church, and they wanted to restore the biblical and patristic primitivism of the primitive early church fathers. I thought that that was really intriguing. And Chauncey Fatsack says he wants me to do some things on St. Jude and St. Michael. I know that St. George was from the Caucasus Mountains, wasn't he? But yeah, I'll take a look at them. Cornelius Jansen was not a saint. Actually, he never was a saint. But it's interesting that he proposed like a Catholic republic in Belgium. Let's see here. I know about Saint Michael the Archangel. All right. Are there any questions about Jansenist restorationism, patristic and biblical restorationism? And I don't see anything, so I guess that's it. Have a good night.